Hey folks, with the Shadowlands having been out for a couple of months, it's time to revisit the eternal question of feral affinity versus balanced affinity. In my beta video I thought Cat would come out on top, but everywhere it's Owl. Today we're going to look at why balanced affinity is favoured, what I missed, and whether Catweaving still has a place. So let's get started. To begin with, let's look at what each of the talent grants, each being a passive, a CC and damaging abilities. Balanced affinity gains an extra 5 yards on all abilities. Typhoon knockback as its CC, and the abilities Moonkin Form, Star Surge, that is a casted version not instant, Starfire and the passive Eclipse mechanic, meaning when you cast 2 Wraths or Starfires in a row, the other will become empowered for a short time. It is a common misconception that Balanced Affinity or Moonkin Form increases the damage of Sunfire and Moonfire. This is not true unless you are under the effects of Heart of the Wild, which we'll talk about later. Feral Affinity meanwhile grants an extra 15% movement speed, Maim as its CC, and the abilities Rake, Rip, Swipe, and some passive bonuses to Shred. We're going to compare all of the aspects of these talents, starting with the passives, the CCs, the different damage patterns and situations before looking at how they interact with Heart of the Wild and convoke the spirits. Starting with passives, this is a tough one. 5 yards on all abilities may not seem like much, and in dungeons it really is not. But in larger raid rooms where everyone is spread out, such as Darkvein, you may find Tranquility does not reach everyone you need, and the extra 5 yards can mean extra players get in. 15% movement speed meanwhile means that you are quicker to escape harm, or can get where you need to be. These passives never make or break the talent, but the two effects are fairly balanced, so we'll call this one a draw. For CC, Typhoon is the clear winner. While the knockback and slow is not much of a CC, knockbacks are rare, useful, and it is instant. Maim is really poor in comparison, it requires combo points to use as well as cat form. Despite all the downsides, it's just a single target stun, something that almost every class has. Before we start on damage, let's touch a bit on melee versus ranged. Generally speaking, ranged is better because you are flexible at where you can stand. Melee, however, is more mobile, so these two would normally balance out. The issue, however, is the game does not consider you a melee player, even when in Feral Affinity, in cat form, or in melee. For many boss fights this is not an issue, but for some, such as Sludgefist, it is. You could be paired with a ranged player with your chains, and either they have to come into melee with you, reducing their damage by making them move, or you have to leave melee and only use Wrath. While many times this point would be a draw, sometimes melee simply loses. We also need to touch on the damage style. Cat deals damage mainly via dots, whereas Owl is cast time spells. Cat style tends to be better, as it lets you keep dealing some damage while you spend some time healing. It does, however, have the weakness that's inherent to dots, and that is that they need time to work. It also needs combo points to build up to Rip, whereas Star Surge does not need any such thing. And finally, before damage, we will touch on Circle of Life and Death, the best DPS legendary and most commonly used in Mythic Plus. This increases the haste of all of your dots by 25%, but it's important to remember this is not a 25% damage increase, it is speed. That means that you need to apply dots more often. Therefore, while this is a damage increase more to Feral Affinity than Balanced Affinity due to Feral's emphasis on dots, if you are not maintaining a high enough uptime during the period of the fight, it loses power until it benefits nothing. If you imagine a boss where you only used Rip once on the pull, it would deal the same damage regardless of whether you had Circle or not. However, bosses are not always equal over the course of their duration. Certain phases may be more important to deal damage in, or there may be a vulnerability window, or times that you can spend dealing damage. Overall, this means Circle still benefits Cat slightly more, but it is dependent on uptime, and that is how we are going to be splitting the damage. For single targets on a low global cooldown usage, Balanced Affinity comes out ahead. Outside Moonfire and Sunfire, that both will use so we won't talk about them much, Owl can use Star Surge every 10 seconds. In comparison, Cat has to use Rake until it can eventually use Rip. As you get to higher global cooldown usages, and Feral Affinity can maintain close to 50% uptime on Rip and Rake, that's about half of your global cooldowns on damage, it has pulled ahead and is definitely going to stay ahead. On 2 targets, if you can afford the globals to rake both targets, Cat starts ahead and stays ahead as long as you can spend the globals. For larger packs of 3 or more, the lines become a bit more blurred. While Cat has the stronger AoE in Swipe and can multi-dot with Rake, Circle makes Moonfire and Sunfire tick so quickly that often you'll spend most of your time simply refreshing them. You cannot do this in Cat form, but you can in Moonkin form, so Cat must fill in any spare DPS global cooldowns it might find with Swipe and Shifting, whereas Moonkin just has to use like a single target Star Surge. That said, if the targets die quickly, Moonfire may not be worth it, and Swipe from Cat form is going to be the winning choice. It really depends on how close they are to dying. We have a few more abilities to weigh up, all of them cooldowns, starting with Heart of the Wild. This 5-minute cooldown, or lower with conduits, increases the damage of your Feral or Balance affinities, and buff one of them. For Feral, Shred crits proc a bonus combo point, but for Balance, Star Surge is instant. This is massive, but it's not the only win for the Owl. Moonfire and Sunfire are Balance abilities. They too are buffed by 30%. This means that you should use Heart of the Wild, but never actually even need to enter Moonkin form, just using Sunfire and Moonfire, and you'll still be gaining a 30% buff on those abilities. While melee swings in Feral are buffed, losing this buff on Moonfire and Sunfire means that the Cat just can't pull out as much damage during the window. Lastly, we have the Covenant abilities. Kyrian is a damage increase, so it scales with both specs equally as they do. Venthyr is the same, but a longer cooldown to every second line up with Heart of the Wild, helping out the Balance affinity. Meanwhile, Adapters Swarm from the Necrolord buff dots and therefore benefits Feral affinity more. Finally, we have the most common, Convoke the Spirits from the Night Fae. While most generic spells are designed to balance out, the damage during the 4-second windows is roughly the same. However, we're going to look at how each usually ends and the special abilities that you might cast. Feral Affinity will end with usually full combo points and energy, regardless of how you started, allowing a Ferocious Bite to be used instantly afterwards. You will also have Tiger's Fury up, that is increasing the damage of your Feral abilities for a while, if you can keep attacking of course. Balance Affinity will gain no resources, but it will have cast Starfall, a monstrous AoE ability that will keep ticking away even if you revert to healing. Starfall has no target capped either, it cannot be understated how powerful this is. On rare occasions you may also cast Full Moon, which is another chunk of AoE damage, and this is much better than the single target equivalent that you would get from Feral. One of the reasons for me underestimating Balance Affinity on beta, probably the biggest one, was how powerful on cooldown this AoE Convoke is for this affinity. It is exceptionally powerful in Mythic Plus. Feral Affinity's rare move just cannot compete, and the Balance Affinity will always win on AoE Convokes, whereas Feral Affinity will come out ahead on single target if it can make use of the Tiger's Fury that it casts. Overall, with everything covered, Balance Affinity nearly always comes out ahead or equal. I knew from beta that it was going to be strong on lower global cooldown usages, and with as much damage that's coming in during raids and dungeons this tier, the global cooldowns that you can spend on DPS are low, which means it's Balance Affinity's time to shine. That is not to say that Feral does not have its place, but it's usually for soloing content, be it out in the world or in Torghast. It likely still has a place in arenas, though don't quote me on that, and lower mythics where you can spend more time dealing damage, but assuming you are pushing content to your limit, in most cases you will find Balance Affinity and Owlweaving superior. Who knows what the next seasons will bring though, Feral Affinity still has areas where it shines, so we will see. And as always, thanks for watching.